I'm back. There is a little bit of this video at the end that you will need to know, and I have, after editing and uploading it, figured out at exactly what minute you really need to start for what you need to know for the exam. So the beginning part of this video has some really interesting stuff about what happens to the spinal nerve after the two roots come together. So please feel free to watch that. It is interesting. And I think actually the next slide, this slide here, is particularly interesting for a clinical reason as well. So I'll get to that one later in this video. And finally, when you get to this slide, that is information that you will need to know for the exam. So please make sure you pay attention to that. I'll make a note of the time on the page in Canvas that I post this video. This is another diagram showing you a cross section of a spinal cord here and the makings of our spinal nerve. The two roots, there's the posterior root ganglion right there. There's a posterior root, anterior root. You can see they've zoomed out even more, and now we can see things like the dura here, that thin layer, and then the adipose tissue in the epidural area right here above the dura. We can also see that this is our spinal nerve right here. The spinal nerve actually immediately branches into two major branches. This is called the anterior ramus. It's not on your structure list. I decided to go without it. And this one back here is the posterior. That's the first major division except for this thing, which I'm going to ask you to ignore. It's autonomic. I'm going to come back to it later, I promise, in chapter 18. But for now, let's just deal with the somatic stuff. These are the two major divisions, the anterior and the posterior ramus. Ramus also means branch. So that's the first two major branches of your spinal nerve. Eventually it's going to branch and branch even more as it heads to different muscles or different parts of your skin. Usually I do have students know these. You do not need to know them. I am pointing them out because I think they're interesting. These initial rami actually are part of early fetal development. Again, you don't have to know this, but when you have your early fetus, it basically, this is not really what, it's actually at this point, sorry, it would be an embryo, but bear with me. And I'm going to make it look like a blob. Really? Okay, that's like our vertebrate blob with a head up here and the spinal cord that's eventually developing. So that's brain in there. And just fundamentally, this is a vertebrate thing. You have a division between the front and the back. So, of course, we would know this as the posterior or the dorsal and the anterior or the ventral part of our little embryo. This is a fundamental anterior-posterior division that comes very, very early before you can really see it's a human. It looks maybe vertebrate-ish, so, you know, like a vertebrate, like your dog is a vertebrate or a fish. And you just get this basic division of the body, anterior-posterior, and that's this. These two branches are reflected as the anterior and the posterior that develop very, very early. Notice that the posterior is much smaller than the anterior. The anterior carries a lot more axons, a lot more information, because interestingly enough, the posterior, quote, half of the embryo, I'm going to put it in quotes because it doesn't end up being half of you. It's basically just really your back muscles. So back muscles, what do I mean? Let's think, what are the muscles that run alongside each of your vertebrae? Axial muscles. And hopefully one of you is thinking this set of muscles called erector spinae and some other muscles we didn't learn, some other smaller ones. That is your, quote, back half, and your anterior, quote, half is everything else. Oops, did not spell everything else correctly. Wait, I have an undo function. So everything else, and by that I mean, well, you know, the front part of your torso where your abdominal muscles are, and all of your limbs. All of the limbs ultimately grow out of the front half of the body, not out of the posterior. So that is a little blurb for your information. I honestly don't know whether your lab instructors are going to have you know the anterior and the posterior ramus, but I'm not. I won't ask you on it. I will not ask you on an exam. Oh, and by the way, notice the posterior ramus goes up to these muscles. That's erector spinae, or at least spinalis is there. Okay. One more thing that's not going to be on the exam. Probably should have warned you in the previous slide. Everything from here on out is not things you need to know, so don't stress, but are nonetheless things I normally have students know and I think are really interesting. This coloring of is individual of different stripes, pretty neat looking. These different stripes, each one is called a dermatome. So it actually means skin map. And it's a map on your skin of what area of the body does each spinal nerve innervate. So for instance, I'm going to go to an easy one. T8, your 8th thoracic nerve. It wraps around your body. And so this entire area of skin here, anything that touches that area, the sensory neurons are going to go into T8 spinal cord level. Vice versa, if you want to move, say, this is probably an intercostal muscles, ribs right there, between the ribs there. The motor neurons are going to come out of T8 spinal cord level and go to your muscles there at this particular area of your body. It gets more complicated in the limbs, but actually if you just, made him stretch his arms out kind of like a T, you'd see like C5 if his arms were or his upper limbs were in a T. C5 would just go make up a much longer ring than say T8 because you have the upper limbs coming out. Things get a little weirder down here in the lower limbs. I don't know if you remember this, but I told you that, the lower limbs of mammals got kind of flipped over. It's like if you turned your hands over and started walking on the palms of your hands, walking on the plantar surface. So everything gets a little flipsy here. So the lower limb ones don't work as well unless, I guess you can stretch a lot and you're really good at yoga because you have to kind of go like that and flip your foot over. So you'd be like this with your feet flipped over in some bizarre way. Actually, I'm sure you'd have to break some bones in order to actually do that or just tear some ligaments. Anyway, so things get a little more complicated in the limbs as they grow out, but you can see there's just this pattern, the dermatome map, that shows you where each spinal cord level and each, set of spinal nerves, what area of the body does it go to and what muscles does it move, what skin is it providing, or what part of the skin is going to which particular spinal nerve. And I would never ask students, even, the students that get to see this in lecture, to memorize things like, which spinal nerve does your pinky go to? It would be C8. Or your thumb is C6, blah, blah, blah. I would never do that. I ask students to know what dermatome means. Usually it means just, the area of skin that each of the spinal nerves innervates. But I'm not going to have you know that. I just thought it was cool and I thought I should show you. By the way, a friend of mine, when she was in med school, this was her Halloween costume. She bought like a white, shirt and a pair of leggings and then painted on dermatome. So it was pretty cool. So I bet she memorized where each spinal nerve innervates which area of the body. Let's get rid of my scrawl. The first set of actual nerves that I want you to know, in the next video, I'll go through some other nerves that go to the limbs. They get a little more complicated. But the nerves that go to the trunk or the torso, those are all pretty straightforward. They just come out of whatever spinal cord level, and this is one of the T's here. They're going to come out of that spinal cord level, and they make a spinal nerve the way you always do. And then they wrap around between the ribs, and they innervate that area. So basically, exactly, that looks fun. Exactly what you see here from, basically the, and I know what I did wrong. There. Nope, still. Oh, there's my blue guy. Basically, this area right here is intercostal nerves, really straightforward. They just come out of the left and right and wrap around and pretty much meet in the middle, in the midline, in the anterior. Great. So in the next video, I'm going to explain what happens to the limbs because you get these weird things called plexuses, a little more complicated than this straightforward distribution. Oh, one other thing. Just going to torture you. Again, not something you need to know at the exam, but I bet those of you that work in healthcare, if you've ever worked with the elderly, you've seen shingles. And it is related to this issue. Shingles is an issue on the skin, so what does it have to do with the nervous system? Well, shingles is, in fact, the chickenpox virus, which it's escaping me technical name for that virus. But interestingly, this particular virus, latch on, and when you get it when you're maybe 9, or if you've been vaccinated, apparently this will happen as well. One of the viral particles could have latched onto one of your sensory neurons, actually, here at, say, this area of your body. And then that virus actually travels back into the cell body of the posterior root ganglion, because it's sensory, and it will just, chill there for maybe 70 years. And then when you're 80 years old, it, for whatever reason, reproduces a bunch of itself, comes back, and becomes a nasty outbreak. And so those of you that have seen it or had it, usually happens in the elderly, but it can happen in younger people as well. They have, and it usually only one spinal nerve, chances of the virus managing to take hold in more than one is less likely. And it's usually on one side only, right or left side. You'll see this stripe area of, that breakout of the itchy, nasty rash that's chickenpox, basically. And, when it comes the second time, only in a particular area like that, we call it shingles. So shingles, interestingly, those viruses follow this dermatome map. So somebody usually only has, say, a particular area affected, maybe a couple spinal nerves, but usually only the left or the right. So just by chance, those are the only ones, the only virus particles, or the only spinal nerves that the virus was able to latch onto and stay alive. Okay, that's it. Sorry for a little bit of tangential information, but interesting stuff. Now you know shingles or chickenpox virus that actually is hiding out inside a sensory neuron. Oh, and by the way, that's why it's itchy. It's itchy and can be not just itchy, extremely painful. Shingles is miserable because it's sitting right on your sensory neuron and receptor. All right. See you all for the next one. Take care.